And Robert Menzies is a huge advocate for appeasement. And he's a big advocate for give Hitler what he wants and he'll back off. In hindsight, dumb move. But it did make sense at the time. And he is not unlike all of the world leaders, Neville Chamberlain in Britain, and basically just kind of says, yeah, we need to give Hitler what he wants and we need to get him to be happy. And also, we've also got to remember that at the back end of World War I, Germany was screwed over so hard. Like, we were way too punitive in how Germany was punished, and effectively that contributed to creating the Nazi Party. This is a quote from Robert Menzies. This comes in July of 1939. History will label Hitler as one of the great men of the century.
Wow.
This was 2 months before the invasion of Poland.
It was aged like a fine wine.
Yes.
Jeez.
And so obviously when Menzies comes back for round 2 in the 50s, like if you're Labour, you've just got to bring that up over and over and over again. Hey, what'd you say, 1939 again? Like that's political dynamite forever. And that haunts Menzies for the rest of his life. But he does overcome it one day, but not this day. So when Hitler invades Poland, he immediately declares his support for Britain when Britain declares war on Germany. Bit of an issue for Australia, though. Australia is not in the same situation as Britain. For Britain, their primary concern is Nazi Germany because they're in Europe. For Australia, Hitler's got no ambition of conquering Australia. He couldn't care less about Australia. For all people talk of Hitler wanting to dominate the world, that was less important. It was dominating Europe. That's what he cared about. So Australia, we're not under any national security threat by Hitler doing what he's doing in Europe. We're under kind of allegiance, like because we've got such a strong allegiance to Britain, we've got that tie.
The king.
Yes, but we don't have a direct national security threat. But Menzies is getting quite concerned. So he declares war because we're going to support Britain, but he's not as hesitant to go quite as gung-ho as what we went in World War I. So in World War I, we were like, yep, support the mother country, let's throw all of our troops, and we've got no national security threat at home, we've got nothing to worry about, let's put them all in Europe. World War II is a little bit different.
Japan.
Yes. They had they reinvented themselves. A new year, new Japan.
So where were Japan, what were they doing in World War I?
Mainly fighting off kind of outskirts of the German colonial empire. So things like they kind of took over islands like Micronesia and that sort of thing. They also, they were a minor player, but they were still in support of the Allies. We often forget about the kind of colonial battles in World War I. Australia took New Guinea off the Germans as well. So Japan, they come to the Paris Peace Conferences. They've got one demand and one demand only. We want a clause in the peace conferences that says all races are equal.
Interesting.
Pretty big demand, right? It's the one thing they say.
Japan said that.
Japan said that.
Okay. That would not really align them with the Germans then.
Yes, exactly right. So this is Imperial Japan in 1919.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Sorry, this is pre-Imperial Japan. This is Democratic Japan 1919.
Yeah.
They go, yep, racial equality clause. America, Britain, Australia, France, what do you think? What do you reckon happens?
Well, it sounds like they say no. It sounds like they.
There's 2 countries that lead the no campaign on this one.
Australia.
Yeah.
US.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
That's our contribution to the Paris Peace Conferences is that we struck down the racial equality clause. So from America, it was
on what grounds? Why on earth would we strike that down?
Something to do with Aboriginal people.
White Australia, yeah. So less Aboriginal, more immigration policy at the time.
Yeah.
And America, it was for Jim Crow segregation laws.
Yeah.
So if you kind of actually had that clause in, it would not reflect well on your own country's practices. So Japan are like, what the heck? You're literally talking about changing over of territories, putting a US $40 billion reparation payment on Germany. We're like, hey, all races are equal. Yeah. And the Allies are like, yeah, nah. Nuh-uh. So Japan frequently gets screwed over in the 20s. There's something called the Washington Naval Conferences that come in 1923. More or less, it's a policy that limits them to having 60% of the size of America's Navy. And they agree to it because they don't want to annoy America, but they're like, basically the agreement is you can only have 60% of America's Navy size. okay, whatever. Like that kind of sucks.
Yeah, that seems a bit odd.
Over the 20s, again, democracy is new. They do not have a democratic tradition. It got instituted in the 1800s when the Europeans kicked the Tokugawa shogunate off because they wanted whale oil, and then they instituted all these European practices and put European democracy in Japan. So the Japanese people don't care for it at all. And the remnants of samurai culture is still very much there, and it's a heavy military culture. So the Japanese military is like, what are we like? Democracy is just leading to us getting screwed over consistently. And so eventually what happens is the military start having a really strong hold in parliament, and they fill up a lot of parliamentary seats with military men. In 1931, they actually go and invade Manchuria. That's northeastern China. The Japanese government doesn't sanction this. The military just does it. And then the Japanese government's in a sticky situation. Either they admit that they can't control their own military, or they have to go along with it. And they go along with it. They're like, oh, yeah, we actually, that is true. We did mean that. And what that shows is that the military can get away with whatever they want. And so the Japanese military then start making bolder and bolder moves all throughout the 1930s. The League of Nations at the time, they respond to Japan by saying, you can't have Manchuria, that's China's. And they say, you've got to get out of there before we send in peacekeeping forces or anything like that. Japan is pretty annoyed with that. From Japan's point of view, what's the great irony in occupying Manchuria and being denied Manchuria?
Well, so what's their stake in Manchuria? I can't quite remember. Why do they think it's theirs to begin with?
It's kind of considered... There's the first Sino-Japanese war in the 1890s. So that gives them control of Korea. Northeastern China that's close to Korea. Basically considered an extension of that. More or less, it's just wanting to build an empire.
Right.
And they're like, Europe, why are you... You are the biggest...
That's been your thing for the past 2 centuries.
Precisely. And we just want a little empire. You have a big empire. And so Japan basically, puts the middle finger out, leaves the League of Nations. Because they're really bitter towards Europe now, they start turning towards Germany and start turning towards Italy. And that's when you have the Anti-Comintern Pact, and that's where you start to get the alliance locked in stone. But Japan doesn't get involved in the war until 1941. They're not in the war in 1939. They make some bold moves, you have the Nanjing Massacre in 1937, where it's the Chinese Holocaust basically. So many innocent Chinese are just slaughtered by the Japanese. And then in 1939, they're a huge threat, but they haven't done anything yet, apart from China. China's the only place they've looked to take over. So for Menzies to kind of come full circle, this is where it's a little bit different between World War I and World War II. World War I, he's like, yep, happily, well, not him personally. Australia's like, yep, happily, we'll send all these soldiers over to Europe to help the UK. But in World War II, Menzies is way more cautious. And he's like, look, we'll help you, but you need to help us because we're worried about Japan and Asia.
Yeah.
The reputation that Menzies has is that he's basically was a suck up to Britain. I don't think that's fair. I don't think that's actually true. I think Curtin was way better at putting the middle finger up to Britain than Menzies was. But Menzies tried to talk Churchill around all the time. He just wasn't able to do it very successfully. So he's like, okay, we need support. We need your help to basically defend ourselves against Japan because we've got our own national security threat this time round. Churchill is like, sorry, mate, I'm fighting the Nazis here.
Yeah.
And he's like, but seriously, Singapore can fall. You have no idea how quickly Japan could advance through the Pacific.
Yeah.
And Churchill's just like, she'll be right.
Yeah. Yeah, big whoop.
Yeah.
The boys on the Kokoda.
So, Menzies is at home. He's got to pass some moves. The first one he passes is the National Security Act to institute conscription.
Boo.
That is only applicable in home territory. So there's a pretty sticky situation where you have, because conscription wasn't allowed for foreign overseas territory, we had an issue where once the Japanese, this will come in I'll elaborate more on this in the Curtin episode, once the Japanese were pushed out of Australia and New Guinea by conscript forces, then they passed into Dutch New Guinea, the conscript forces had to be like, oh, can't step over that line. Sorry guys, back off. But he did institute basic conscription. He set up a second AIF, Australian Imperial Force, And basically, he tried to pitch to the Australian Parliament doing away with parties. Because that's what Britain effectively did. Britain did a united government under Churchill. Neither Conservative nor Labor, but Churchill's government.
Was that just for the war time?
Just for the war, yeah.
Yeah.
Menzies pitched the same idea. John Curtin, leader of Labor's like, no. What? I want your job. And so John Curtin turns them down. We're going to roll around to the 1940. So 1939, it's just known as the phony war in Europe. Japan hasn't made any real moves in the Pacific. And we're going to roll around to 1940. August of 1940. Pretty much fast forwarding a whole year from World War II beginning. Have you heard of the Canberra air disaster before?
No.
I think it has a section in the War Memorial.
Right. No, I've never heard of it.
Maybe.
Look, I can't scold you for not knowing it. My mind was in Questacon when we went to the War Memorial right before Questacon.
Yeah.
When we went to Canberra in year 6, and my head was just...
I remember the tomb for the unknown soldier, but that was it.
Yeah.
That was all I can really...
I remember
recall.
a plane.
The air disaster does involve a plane.